Good morning, everyone. I'm Gönül Tol. I'm the director of the Turkey program at the Middle East Institute, and I'm also a senior fellow at MEI's Frontier Initiative. I'm pleased to welcome you to today's discussion on electoral dynamics and Turkish opposition's strategy to defeat President Erdoğan in the upcoming elections, which are scheduled to take place next year in June of 2023. Many of you might be following what's happening on the domestic scene. There is a six-party opposition bloc in Turkey that is working together to unseat Erdoğan and his Justice and Development Party. And the political context, in my opinion, is favorable for an opposition when there is a growing economic crisis in the country. The anti-refugee sentiment is getting stronger. Key constituencies such as the country's youth, the Kurds, the business community are all very critical of the way Erdoğan is running the country. And he's losing ground. President Erdoğan is losing ground in the polls. So can the opposition beat Erdoğan? What is their strategy? And how confident are we that Erdoğan will respect election results if he loses? So to answer these questions and more, I'm joined by great panelists. You have their detailed bios on our website, but let me briefly introduce them. Dr. Berk Esen is an assistant professor of political science at Sabancı University, based in Istanbul. Dr. Ersin Kalacıoğlu is a senior scholar at Sabancı University's Istanbul Policy Center. And Dr. Ali Çarkoğlu, he is a professor of international relations at Koç University in Istanbul. Well, many thanks for taking the time to talk to us today. Before we begin, let me remind our audience that they can ask questions anytime during the panel using the Q&A function on your screens. And without further ado, let me begin. Dr. Çarkoğlu, thank you, and let me begin with you.
All right, thank you.
So it's widely accepted in political science that voter behavior is heavily influenced by the economic conditions in the country at the time of the elections. And in Turkey, there's an economic crisis. The country's annual inflation rate is what somewhere it's, I think, soared to 75%, which is the highest since 1998. And economists are saying that it will get worse. Food and energy costs skyrocketed. Unemployment is quite high, particularly among the youth. Yet President Erdoğan is still a very popular leader who has the backing of around 30% of voters. So how do you explain that? Is Turkey an exception when it comes to voter behavior, and what are the key drivers of voter behavior? I mean, how significant, for instance, is ideology or party identification in defining who people vote for?
Well, Turkey is not an exception. I don't think it's an exception. Our two volumes that you see provide enough data to back this diagnosis that, Turkish voting behavior patterns are very much in line with international literature. To briefly summarize the expectations, we have basically two main theoretical frameworks. One is emphasizing positional or spatial considerations, and the other one is more an explanation on the basis of political socialization. Political socialization takes place over time, over a long period of time, and is more stable, even in the Turkish case, despite party closures and the leadership changes that transform the party's ideological stances even.
So to clarify, I'm sorry, to clarify for our audience, by political socialization, you mean party identification?
Party identification, getting to know about politics starts as early as, the childhood. Ersin Hoca has an article going all the way back to 1980, documenting this for the Turkish case. And primary school students have sophisticated understanding of leaders and their positions. And this develops over time, especially in countries where interruptions to political processes do not take place. You have the Republicans and Democrats for the longest period in the US. In the Turkish case, we have only CHP as a continuous party. All the others have had quite a number of breaks in their leadership and in their and even in their names. But for the Turkish case, the short-term evaluations of the economy is obviously important. However, these evaluations are filtered through the lenses of party identification and ideology. Voters evaluate politics with motivated reasoning. There are important partisan differences in the way economic conditions are evaluated, and that gives a lot of advantage to the incumbent AKP in our case, because our analyses indicate that the AK Party or the AKP has the largest group of party identifiers, which has developed since 2002.
So if I may, I'm sorry to interrupt, but so can I, again, to clarify for the audience, you're saying that economic considerations play an important role in voter behavior, but the way they interpret the state of economy is colored by their ideology and party identification. So the same economic conditions, in other words, could be interpreted as not as bad by the incumbent supporter, while the opposition might see it in a different light.
Of course.
Is that right?
That's precisely where I was heading. The AK Party supporters typically see the economy in a much more favorable perspective. And the opposition, looking at the same objective, there is no objective data, but everything is subjective in this instance. Looking at the same economy, they see a completely different picture. And we also need to see where the voters place themselves on the ideological spectrum. People or academics in Turkey tend to think that ideology is no longer important. However, as a shortcut to a complicated set of questions, ideology still provides a very useful tool in the hands of the voter. And we see that Turkish ideological distribution of the voters is providing a comfortable zone of operation for especially the right of center parties. Center has collapsed since 1990 from somewhere around 30-35% of the voters. In our most recent surveys, we find them close to 15%. The left has remained quite constant at around 19-25%, and 45-50% of the voters have switched predominantly from center to the right of center. And this gives a basis for evaluating where the AK Party MHP coalition could go. It looks like the CHP is already the main opposition party. The CHP is attracting some votes from the centrist voters, but the left is also shared with the Kurdish left party, HDP, which obtains around 10 to 13% of the vote. So within the 25%, there remains only about 10 to 12% of the vote for the CHP. The rest is actually coming from the centrist voters. And the new E party, or the Good Party, which actually is a splinter from the nationalist MHP, is attracting not only the remaining centrist votes, but also votes from the right of center. So in that, from that perspective, it's obvious that the Good Party, or the E party, is the main threat to the disillusioned right of center parties, not particularly MHP, perhaps because they rely on more ideological nationalist vote, which is more stable, but the AK Party constituency is likely to switch slowly towards the E party. So that's the main, the name of the game for the opposition. The opposition is a coalition of 6 parties, but mainly 2 parties. The other remaining 4 parties are very minor parties or new parties about which we have very little information, reliable information, as to where their constituencies are coming from. But the E party is attracting right of center support. CHP is aiming to attract the centrist vote. And those who actually were disillusioned in 2018 about the AKP performance were actually voting for the nationalist MHP, which actually is part of the People's Alliance. Therefore, that kind of a switch from AK Party to MHP wasn't that big of a threat to the alliance. But now we have both the E party as well as the splinters, Deva of the ex-minister Babacan, and the Future Party of Ahmet Davutoğlu, both of whom were ex-ministers of the AK Party. Therefore, AK Party disillusioned voters could actually go to not only the E party, but also the Babacan and Davutoğlu parties.
Well, fascinating data that you're sharing with us, and I have a question about E party. As if I'm not mistaken, that's the fastest growing party in the country. And given what you've said on the prominence of ideology in Turkish voter behavior, I was wondering what makes E party so attractive to voters? Is it its nationalist ideology? But I would assume there are others who make similar claims, if it's the anti-refugee sentiment. So what is it that makes E party so appealing? Briefly before, so that I could ask my next question to Dr. Kalacioğlu.
Sure. The main attraction is that E party is not a left-wing party. Left doesn't have much of an appeal despite all the economic difficulties. People tend to react to the secularist stance of the CHP primarily. But the E party has this nationalist and somewhat conservative, but not very conservative. Somewhat, I say, because E party has had this campaign advertisement using Caliph Ali's way, for instance, to attract some conservative vote. But after a couple of airing of that commercial on TV, they decided to abandon it. And now they are trying to appeal to the same voters with a musical commercial that lasts about nearly 2 minutes.
And also Alevis, right? They
And
are
also Alevis, sure. So there is a lot of uncertainty as to where the real attraction of E-Party is. And I don't really trust the polling results, because there are those who show E-Party at around 10% and others very questionably showing them above 20%. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. So we'll have to wait and see. And the party is still making its own decisions about where its voters are.
Well, Dr. Kalaycıoğlu, I would like to turn to you next. You co-authored a book with Dr. Çarkoğlu, and you argue that the historical and cultural divide between rural and conservative groups and urban and modernized groups is the key factor shaping election results. So how should that guide the opposition's strategy?
It's not quite that. But before I begin answering, I would like to clarify something. I still teach at Sabancı University. I'm not only associated with the Istanbul Policy Center. Coming back to your question, what we're arguing in the book, of course, flying very close to the data we collected, is that Turkey, after the Second World War, went through a dramatic transformation in 2 generations, from a very urban, from a very rural society to a highly urban society, especially after 1980s. In 1950, when Turkey had its first free and fair elections, approximately 3/4 of the population or voters were residing in the rural areas and villages. Many of them small farmers. A few in the east had large swaths of land controlled by them, even fewer in central and western Anatolia at the time. Now, most of that in the western Anatolia and central Anatolia are gone, and they have also slightly changed in eastern Anatolia and southeastern Anatolia, but huge swaths of the population moved out of the rural areas into the urban centers, creating a huge urban poor bloc in Turkey. Now, in our research, we discovered that approximately 40% on the average, 35 to 40% of all voters are people who constitute this bloc, which is the largest voting bloc in Turkey. And they report to us that they have never had any secure job or a job that paid them any wages, salary, or they work for any pay in their lives. Now, more than 3/4 of these people are women, as you may easily expect, who had been contributing somewhat as producers to the small family farms in rural areas once upon a time. They are now consumers, and they're not doing anything, perhaps looking after the house and after their children, perhaps grandchildren, in essence. But they're net consumers, and this is a huge change. And with them, with this change from rural to urban society, creating a huge mass of urban poor voters who are not well integrated into the urban environment, mainly because this phenomenon occurred in a very short period of time, very fast. It was like a deluge. Istanbul's population increased by more than 500,000 per year between 1989 and 1994. Now, this is, for your American audience, larger than the inner counties of, say, Minneapolis, Minnesota. So one Minneapolis, Minnesota per year seem to have moved into Istanbul. That's the volume we're talking about here. And there's no way the Istanbul resources could have absorbed this kind of thing. So it's created a huge urban metropolitan problem and had an enormous impact on the economy of Istanbul and of course on traffic. Anybody who comes and travels in Istanbul will realize that the traffic is a mess, mainly because of this reason. We're still investing heavily on subways and public transport, etc. But the municipality is running after the phenomenon, not riding with the tide or not in front of it. So that's one major issue that emerged out of this. And they seem to have constituted one major block for all politicians to exploit to their benefit, if they could. From 2002 onwards, again, our data indicate that anywhere between 55 to 60% of this population systematically voted for the Justice and Development Party. Not all of them, because not all of them are Orthodox revivalist Islamists. If you're not an Orthodox revivalist Islamist, your chance of voting for the Justice and Development Party is not that great. You can vote for them for other reasons, economic reasons, opportunism, because you believe that you can get some kind of tangible economic benefits in the form of, say, credit to buy a house, a good mortgage deal or something of that sort. And in return, you vote for this political party for this kind of benefit you receive during their tenure. This is possible, but those numbers are relatively humble in comparison to the Orthodox revivalist Islamist bloc. I'm talking about the Sunni Muslims, basically. And these people have constituted a basic core of the support for the Justice and Development Party in major cities, all major cities of the country in general, metropolitan areas more so. But at the same time, the structure of the economy change in Turkey from agricultural economy to industrial economy. So we have now an industrial economy, which is also at the same time converting into heavy dependence on services sector, which is also a major phenomenon that has been taking off since the 1990s, especially with tourism and catering, which is a major phenomenon. Now, some of these companies that are established in catering are getting into the American market. Getir, for example. Getir is a company that is operating in New York, and they're advertising it, and you can see them in New York if you visit New York. So this is the sort of thing that seems to be happening. And many of these people are also precariously employed. So they are constituting a precariat and revolting from time to time because of the work conditions that they find themselves under at the same time. So there is dramatic change that's taking place under these circumstances. Now, at this time, when the Justice and Development Party came to power, we discovered that there was a lot of interest in the emerging markets, and a huge amount of credit started to be moving in the direction of the emerging markets, including Turkey. So the Justice and Development Party found easy credit and large amounts of credit to be spent on many investments, especially in infrastructure, roads, railroads, airports, not so much port facilities, but mainly these infrastructural investments, which were relatively attractive to these people, and also in healthcare. Considerable amount of investment went into healthcare and some into education. Suddenly, a large number of educational institutions were opened up in many places. Number of universities increased dramatically by about 5-fold during their tenure. And more of the students who could come out of the secondary schools can now go into university or college education. Although the quality is a different matter, and there seems to be huge problems wrapped up in quality all over the country. So it was this change that seemed to have catered greatest opportunities for this government under these circumstances. So these people who found themselves in this alien environment in urban centers, who could not latch onto that environment, who could not even perhaps understand what was going on in the urban centers, and they found themselves alienated from this environment, had a great opportunity to provide for these politicians. In the 1970s and 80s, when this was just beginning, it was the left-wing political organizations that moved into these newly developing banlieues of big cities of Turkey and had a strong stranglehold over these people, which was scuppered by the 1980 military coup. And that's another phenomenon. Ali Çarkoğlu touched upon it, that there were disruptions in Turkish political socialization. Military coups were the disruptions mainly, which also simply swept away many political parties. In 1981, September 1981, they closed down all political parties, including the Republican People's Party, the party that established the republic, ironically. So it's a very interesting situation. So all Turkish political parties are relatively new. None of them are fully institutionalized, including Justice and Development Party. But this doesn't mean that Justice and Development Party has a immaculately developed organization for canvassing the vote. That's a different phenomenon. So in this environment, we also had a huge impact of international politics, because Turkey is located in a very interesting neighborhood of Balkans, Transcaucasus, and the Middle East. And therefore, whatever happens in the international arena has a big impact on us. With the Cold War ending, we suddenly found ourselves cleansing the left with the military coup at the same time. So no left. Left was sort of in disrepute in the eyes of the many, and they became the other. And it opened up a way for those political parties to operate in an environment where two major identifiers played a great role in determining the mental map of the voters. One is ethnic identity, Kurdish versus Turkish, and various forms of Turkish nationalism. Second happened to be religion and sect, especially Alevi versus Orthodox Islam, which Ali Çarkoğlu has already mentioned, but also these Sunni Orthodox revivalists versus the secular population. And this has created an opportunity for political parties to position themselves strategically as the champions of these downtrodden of the rural poor who are associated with these identities, ethnic and religious at the same time, and presenting them with an opportunity of upward social mobility and also some kind of respect and honor, which is defined alternatively to the urban values of the big cities, and making those as also prestigious or respectful by referencing to these ethnic and religious values that they have been promoting. So they created a polarized image of those who they called Black Turks, who were sort of marginalized, discriminated against. These were the people who were poor, but they were nice, clean people, honest people. All virtue and all morality came out of these people versus the immoral seculars who were controlling the centers. They were drinking rakı, having a nice time, earning huge amounts of salaries and income. They speak a weird language, and they also speak English, French, German, whatever, other Western languages. They're westernized other. So this is a great opportunity for them to create or recreate the polarization that Ali Çarkoğlu mentioned about center periphery, instead dislocating center completely and supplanting it with this new divide, which became increasingly something like an authoritarian populist jargon by the 2010s. And it's now sticking as one currently.
Well,
That's put in a nutshell, that's the argument that we're making.
Well, Dr. Kolaycıoğlu touched upon several important points, which I want to go back to, and particularly the one about how international context shaped domestic political context, and also this cleavage, the historic cleavages between ethnic identity, Turks versus non-Turks, and you have the secular versus Sunni Orthodox identity. So I want to go back to those, but given all those, Dr. Esen, given what Dr. Çarkoğlu said, what Dr. Kolaycıoğlu said about voter preferences, please give us an assessment of the CHP leader Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's leadership, the way he sees this political context. He has certainly dramatically changed the party, in my view, but then why is the party stuck at 25%? Is the CHP doomed to remain an opposition party? Is there something that is missing here that the CHP fails to see, or how do you explain the lack of appeal there?
Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, I think, has certainly changed the Republican People's Party during his 12 years at the helm of this party as this party's leader. Of course, prior to his rise, the CHP was run by Deniz Baykal, who was, of course, a very authoritative figure within the social democratic camp in Turkey. But Baykal had a very limited popular support, and especially after the AKP came to power in late 2002, Baykal gradually shifted the party's agenda to a rather neo-nationalist, or in Turkish we call it ulusalcı, as well as hardline secular position, at times Eurosceptic position that resulted in electoral ghettoization. So basically, going back to what Ali Hoca and Ersin Hoca mentioned about these major socioeconomic transformation that occurred in Turkey, particularly in major metropolitan areas, with these new classes rising, lower middle class, but on the way to become middle class, sort of living in the outskirts of the city, looking for new economic opportunities. They're not necessarily very secular, but they're not also support Sharia. Baykal's strategy ended up not really appealing to any of these groups. And so that's why the party's base has shrunk. Especially after the AKP came to power. And of course, knowing this, Baykal ended up collaborating with the military, tried to ally himself with a number of what we call to be tutelary actors in Turkish politics throughout the 2000s in order to make sure that AKP, even though it has won the elections, will not really be able to effectively govern the country and transform Turkey's political system and thus society. Of course, this was a lost cause because, of course, it's not really a democratic position. Now, I do have a lot of criticisms for AKP, but I think stopping that party using this kind of a pseudo anti-democratic strategy was not really very effective. And I think at the end of the day, it did not really have much chances of success. Right, and so it really failed. So Kılıçdaroğlu came to power in 2010, just before the 2010 referendum, at a time when these tutelary actors in Turkish politics, so the secular judiciary, the presidency, the military, they were all weakened. Of course, in the case of the presidency, it was already captured by Abdullah Gül, the second man of AKP. And after the 2010 referendum, of course, the judiciary would be dramatically transformed. And of course, the Balyoz Ergenekon trials had already begun in 2008 and continued for several more years. So Kılıçdaroğlu, I think, had a different outlook on politics than Deniz Baykal. But even if he actually had the same outlook, I think Baykal's strategy was no longer feasible. So what Kılıçdaroğlu did, especially in the early 2010s, was to purge pro-Baykal people from the party leadership, which was, of course, very important because these people were not popular. They did not necessarily pursue a vote maximization strategy. They didn't really care for even winning the election because they had a non-electoral strategy that they laid out in the previous years. Kılıçdaroğlu also tried to open up the CHP organization, right? Asking for people to join the party. He recruited some new members. In some cases, some of these people became MPs after the 2011 general election and ended up sort of gradually transforming the CHP's outlook as well as its program, ideas, and so on. And as a result of this process, the party moved from getting low 20s to basically 25% of the vote share in just a few years. And of course, on top of that, even going beyond the party's increase in electoral appeal, Kılıçdaroğlu, unlike Deniz Baykal, is a soft-spoken politician. He's very polite. He gives the image of a leader who cares, who listens. And so that allowed CHP to begin to appeal to groups, particularly conservative segments of the society, maybe to a certain extent Kurds, but not so much. It is not as much as the conservative groups, right? He tried to appeal to these groups that were marginalized by CHP and marginalized by the Turkish political system or the old establishment prior to AKP's rise to power. So even if he did not immediately get their votes, at least the CHP's image began to change. So this is where we find ourselves in basically by mid-2010s. Now, over the last few years, I think also Kılıçdaroğlu has succeeded in promoting an opposition alliance, which we know to be very, important in defeating these in defeating populist authoritarian leaders like Erdoğan. So I think, these are some of the positive things that he did. But, right, having said that, coming to the latter part of your question, I think where Kılıçdaroğlu was successful in pushing his party to 25%, transforming its agenda to a certain extent, I think he has recently began to hinder further progress. And that's why we see the CHP vote to be fixed at 25%, even though CHP mayors actually run more than half of the Turkish electorate. In fact, CHP mayors control many of the major metropolitan areas in the country, and yet we don't necessarily see CHP make a huge electoral, we don't necessarily see CHP expand its vote share significantly. I think part of the reason is Kılıçdaroğlu has not really modernized the CHP organization, maybe Istanbul being a possible exception. So this is still not really a very capable mobilizing organization that can really reach out to the voters, particularly in the Anatolian provinces. I think this partly comes down to limitations of the party in organization as well as cadre recruitment. I think Kılıçdaroğlu has really failed to put together an effective, capable team of advisors and politicians at the top of the party leadership around him, right? And I think his Kılıçdaroğlu's political discourse, at least to someone like me who grew up in 1990s, is still very much influenced by 1970s political jargon, which of course has difficulty appealing to young voters. And actually, Turkish electorate is quite young in contrast to, for instance, many developed countries. So I think as a leader, Kılıçdaroğlu has reached his limits. He's not charismatic. He's not an inspiring politician. He can't really reach out to young voters. I think over the last 12 years, he ended up making some strategic mistakes that he still carries to this day. He has failed to really offer a strong alternative economic agenda that could appeal to some of these voters. That
actually, I have a question there. I mean, I think that we're facing a similar dilemma here with Democrats in this country, how cultural issues have come to dominate their agenda and how they've lost the white working class to the Republican Party. So could that be a similar problem of the CHP while they are still, I mean, the cleavage that Dr. Kalaycıoğlu referred to, this secularist versus Sunni Muslim divide or ethnic divide. So those cultural issues have come to dominate the debate at a time when economic considerations are at the top of the voters' agenda. So in that context, we have again question from the audience asking exactly that. If the CHP, from the voters' point of view, if the CHP is credible enough. E-Party, for instance, they have great names. They have a star name, Bilge Yilmaz. He's from Wharton Finance. He's a good name, although he's not a known entity to the voters. But what about the CHP? Do they have a solid team? Do they have a solid economic agenda?
Not at the moment, and I think that's one of the problems that Kılıçdaroğlu faces, and this is something that I think we should use to criticize Kılıçdaroğlu's leadership, because amidst a major economic crisis that Turkey faces, this is probably the first time that we had in more than a generation in which opposition politicians, especially opposition parties like CHP, can actually find an opportunity to overcome this cultural divide that Ersin Hoca Ersin Hoca articulated, and basically focus on economic issues. The problem is, for instance, Kılıçdaroğlu's top economics advisor is Faik Öztürk, a dinosaur left from the late 1990s, doesn't have really any new ideas, can't really inspire anyone. Can't really appeal to young voters or middle-class voters. So I think had Kılıçdaroğlu put together a much more capable economics team, which I think he could have done, especially at a time like this, and appeal to voters directly with some very concrete policy, policy positions, I think he could have expanded his party's support. So I'm not actually very pessimistic about CHP's long-term prospects, because CHP is increasingly becoming a party of the young people, a party of major cities. And unlike US, we actually have quite a high level of urbanization, and quite a high majority of the Turkish electorate lives in 5 or 6 major cities, many of which are controlled by CHP. But because of the presidential candidate discussions and Kılıçdaroğlu's need to become a candidate himself, his leadership has really neglected what CHP has been doing since 2009 in power at these municipality governments. Because in reality, in a number of provinces, including Istanbul and Ankara particularly, CHP mayors have actually proved to be quite capable of addressing people's economic grievances, delivering social services, social assistance programs, even though the government tried to cut off their funding. So this is at this point becoming also a leadership problem in which we have begun. So Kılıçdaroğlu has definitely transformed the party in a positive direction, but we are approaching the limits of what he can do. And at this point, as a leader, I think who's 74 years old, he has approached the end of his career, and he no longer really, gives the image of a leader who can really transform the country, which is why he continues to try to make deals with these other opposition parties, trying to persuade voters, which he and his party cannot persuade on their own.
Dr. Charcoal, going back to you and somewhat related to what we've been talking about here. So opposition coalition built its election strategy on the promise of switching back to a reformed version of a parliamentary system. So how, given everything that we've discussed so far, how wise is that strategy electorally, given, again, voter concerns over economy, over cost of living, refugees, and maybe related to that, how much support is there among the electorate for presidentialism? And I guess you could link that to a, again, related question: how much do voters care about other things, such as Erdoğan's assault on the human rights, on institutions, on democratic norms?
Well, I'm not sure if the opposition really has a well spelled out plan or strategy. To me, they are giving the impression of a muddling through exercise. The reformed parliamentarism topic is too abstract and difficult to understand for the layman. Practicalities also impede that reform to be realized. You need to have at least 360 seats, if not 400, to directly pass it from the Turkish Grand National Assembly. And that kind of seat control in the assembly does not seem to be a realistic objective. I've done a number of simulations. It looks like if the Cumhur Alliance, for instance, loses about 40% of support in their core constituencies in the central Anatolian provinces, and only lost 10% in the metropolitan areas and the rest of the country, they can only control about 276 seats. Without the support of the Kurdish HDP, that's not enough. And collaborating with HDP on anything will be a very polarizing debate in the country, and within CHP as well as the other alliance parties, there will be resistance to actually collaborate with HDP. And there is a lot of other technical issues about this, that the main opposition to HDP stems from the fact that they don't refute any links to the PKK, and they don't refuse any organic links with them. So 400 and plus is almost impossible. They need to obtain, they need to push the AK Party below almost 30%. So far as we can see in all polling, despite the fact that I don't trust them, it doesn't matter if you have large number of polling results. In none of them I have seen AK Party below 30%. So as long as they stick to 30-35% of the vote, it looks like the opposition will not be able to convert the system with a constitutional change back to a parliamentary system of any sort. But from practicalities to public support, it's not, I don't see this as a discussion of support for reform parliamentarism, but rather it's a discussion about refuting Erdoğan's regime. So why do we not want Alaturka presidentialism? Because we don't like Erdoğan. Why do we not like Erdoğan? Not only a personality matter, but because he really did not meet the expectations of the performance that was actually the promise to the people when we switch from parliamentarism to presidentialism.
Actually, I think the opposition is making a little more sophisticated case here, in which it says, you know, we don't want presidentialism because the ills that the country is facing right now, it's all because of presidentialism. We have an economic crisis because there is only one man who makes all the decisions. We have this institution, he hollowed out the institutions, all the problems that we're facing today, including on the foreign policy front, it's all because of this regime. So I think that's a pretty convincing strategy, but without really touching upon the major concern of the voters, which is economy. You can't really make that case convincingly, can you?
Layman on the street, I think, will not be able to form that link between poor performance of the economy and Erdoğan, poor performance in the foreign affairs and Erdoğan's leadership. As a matter of fact, his leadership skills and his machoism on the international arena might be attracting support. So this issue of making the argument against the presidential system is a little difficult to sell to the people. It can only stick if they speak more about the performance, if they speak more about cronyism, if they speak more about corruption. They won't understand anything from foreign affairs. His recent blows against Finland and Sweden and against the Greek Prime Minister Mitsotakis, I think sells quite well among the people.
Yeah, actually, I wanna be very. It's a very important point. Something that I really want to underline, because foreign policy, I think that since the day he came to power, foreign policy has served a great function for Erdoğan. Be it the pro-EU foreign policy or zero problems with neighbors later. After the Arab uprisings, the Islamist foreign policy that he pursued, they all served only one purpose, and that was to consolidate his power. Yeah. So that is the analytical conclusion that I came to, but this is a question to all of you, and please feel free to jump in. So how important is foreign policy based on the poll results? I mean, does that play a significant enough role in voter preferences that Erdoğan keeps going back to the foreign policy whenever there's a problem at home that he cannot handle?
Well, it looks like at the normal politics, any issue about foreign policy will not be an important issue. Turkey is not like Greece, where Greek politicians always use the Turkish threat to mobilize electoral support, as far as I can see from the other side of the Aegean. For Greek domestic politics, Turkish threat is an important issue. It has never been an important issue in Turkish politics. Only perhaps foreign policy became important in 1977 elections, right after Turkish intervention in Cyprus. Well, I mean, that's understandable because there was military engagement there. But in no other time this has become an issue. But it's also important to note that despite all the losses in the military arena, in the operations in northern Iraq, in northern Syria, it doesn't create this negative effect on the politicians. It actually helps them to make the consolidate their nationalist agenda. So foreign policy at crises can be a mobilizing factor if the opposition cannot firmly stand against it by pointing to the fact that performance in non-foreign policy issues is also dismal. And my hunch is that the opposition is almost uniformly supportive of Erdoğan's foreign policy positions. That's no right. One actually came out and negated his policy towards Ukraine and Russia or any policy in Syria. Only once CHP voted against the decision to send troops to Syria, and they are already suffering because of that decision. And EU Party, for instance, voted in favor of that decision. So the alliance is actually divided on that issue. There is no uniform action against foreign policy stances. No one said anything about his arguments against Greece, for instance, recently. And he feels completely in control of foreign policy. And if you watch Turkish TV, there is only a nationalist and neo-nationalist pundits attacking the West, attacking NATO allies, and making arguments that Turkey is a lone wolf and should collaborate with Russia because Russians are pushed to the corner and that's their right to, I've heard this, it's their right to defend themselves attacking Ukraine. And nobody actually objects to that in Turkish media. And that's unfortunate.
There is a
it helps
catch.
a lot for Erdoğan.
There is a catch there. The difficulty is Justice and Development Party and its People's Alliance lives on polarization. They try to create polarization, but there is no basis for polarization. As I have mentioned, there are too many cleavages in Turkey. And these too many cleavages create a very fragmented political culture, and at the same time, very fragmented party system, potentially. If there is a kind of representative democracy, we would have a multi-party system, naturally. However, he tries to create polarization. Foreign policy is an excellent polarization issue. And therefore, the opposition cannot provide more ammunition to Erdoğan by opposing him. So far as this breeds into polarization, they have to go on the defensive here, or actually change the entire setup from polarization to inclusivity. This is what CHP has been trying to do with their reconciliation policy. Helalleşme, they called it. The term is a little bit religious and created a lot of criticisms from the intellectuals, who are often quite dysfunctional in jumping into the fray and making these criticisms. So this kind of, game-changing attacks by opposition are difficult, especially in foreign policy matters. So they stay mute on this issue. And foreign policy is an issue which Erdoğan can use to change the agenda. He's also constantly trying to change the agenda from economics to cultural confrontations, cultural issues, cultural divides, foreign policy issues. So creating a lot of arguments about existential threats to Turkey, beka, as it's called in Turkish, and also creating these opportunities to intervene more effectively in Iraq, which Turkey is doing now, more effectively into Syria, which Turkey is planning to do, it seems, and also saber rattling with Greece, and whatever else opportunity comes up, they will grab it simply because these are agenda changers. They change the agenda from economics, which is, of course, costly for the government, to these kinds of issues. So far as CHP is concerned, I see questions from the chat as well. We have a setup for a multi-party system. We're not like the US. You don't have Democrats and Republicans, that's it. No third party can have any traction. I mean, we've had third party experiences in the US, as you very well know. Ross Perot, etc., getting 18% of the vote in the competition between H.W. Bush and Clinton once upon a time, etc. But these were exceptions than the rule. In Turkey, we have a multi-party setup. Show me a country in the world where the Social Democrats get more than 30% of the vote in Europe. Mr. Scholz got little less than 30%. Labour in the UK, hovering around
Portugal,
30%.
hocam, Portugal.
Well, Portugal is more of an exception. But the thing is, the pattern is all over, even in Sweden, the Social Democrats have been pushed out of, because in the Turkish case, additionally, their ideological position does not have voters. We have produced the evidence. Ali may check me out on this. We calculate that there is around 10% of the electorate occupying that ideological position that the Republican People's Party champions into 10%, and they get 25% of the vote. That's as much as they can go. Can they recreate themselves? I don't know. If you can recreate Turkey, have many more people who are secular, not succumbing to this propaganda of revivalist Islam, okay? And at the same time, this ethnic divide and the brand of nationalism, especially ethnic Turkish nationalism, which has been on the rise, for a very long period of time. If you can somehow shift the entire cultural, political context of Turkey towards a more secular, modern country, more urban, more post-industrial, more post-materialist values that late Engelhardt was talking about, etc., then they may have a real chance of having a greater opportunity to champion themselves. But if they go back to their roots, they go back to 8%. When did they get that? In 2002 elections.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I have one more question for you. But before that, I have a comment. I think one of the reasons why this, particularly the CHP, is unable to challenge Erdogan's foreign policy is their own tradition of seeing foreign policy as beyond daily political debate. It's an apolitical, in a way, theater where, because of military dominance, it's not really open to political debate. And I think that's what, because of that tradition, when it comes to politics stops at water's edge. That is the thinking in
not necessarily. You know, Çelik has had many arguments on contrary to that, and he was skewered, attacked, not by the CHP alone, by everybody else. You are a traitor. You are disloyal.
That's actually my point. That's actually my point. My point is that it's a matter of national survival. When it comes to foreign policy, it shouldn't be about politics. It shouldn't be about political identification, political identity. It's a matter of survival for the state. So politics has to stop there. I think that's the thinking in CHP circles. And I think that's because of the tradition of military having this say in foreign policy making. But so very briefly, there's a reasonable question that I wanted to ask. Howard Eisenstadt is asking, we've been talking about everything else, but everything boils down to the question of, do elections matter? I mean, how confident are we that they're going to be free and fair? And if Erdogan loses, will he just walk away?
Well, they won't be free and fair. We know that. They won't be free and fair. They're trying to change the election into some kind of a plebiscite in which Erdogan will be, acclimated to power again by some kind of uploading voters, etc. That's the motivation. That's how they are moving around. Closing down HDP right before the election, for example, is such a scenario. Will they be able to close down other political parties, just like, for example, in Nicaragua? Recall the last election that Ortega had? He put all the main challengers behind bars and then left 3 or 5 of them who didn't count to compete with them. So we don't know whether this is going to be something like that. But the elections are not going to be free and fair. We know that for sure. Our second book, Elections and Public Opinion in Turkey, we have several chapters explaining what kind of an election environment 2018 was and what kind of election environment is going to be in the next elections. So there's no question about that. But in spite of the fact, will he be able to lose an election? Well, it is possible. It's possible, perhaps even probable, but there is no way of predicting how that mechanism is going to be, because there are so many ifs, buts, etc. And there are so many uncertainties. For example, he declared his candidacy for the presidency in the next elections. He can't run as a president if the Constitution is applied, unless the Grand National Assembly, with an overwhelming majority, decides for an early election. And that's not going to happen in the near future, as far as I can tell. And if that happens, it will be an election that will occur on the same rules as 2018, not on the new regulations that they mandated on the 6th of April, 2022, because they can't kick in for 1 year. So they are caught in a certain trap. And if they run for presidency with Erdogan after, say, May 2023 or May 23, is not going to be an early election. I'm sorry, that's not my definition of early, but I'm not so sure what their definition of early is concerned. So the election in which we'll be fighting around many issues of legitimacy at the same time. So we don't know. Basically, we don't know. There are too many unknowns.
Dr. Esen, please, very briefly.
Well, I mean, I had like several points from the previous round, but let me try to very quickly make them. With regards to the election question, I mean, elections have been neither free nor fair for several years now, and the opposition parties have been operating according to these rules since 2015. So this is not something new. We had these debates before the 2019 local elections, and there were many pessimists who said that Erdogan's candidates will never really step down, but eventually they did. So rather than impose this much power onto Erdogan and sort of suggest that he'll basically not lose, if he loses, he will not go away, I think it's important to give the opposition parties an agency and say that actually, if they can remain united, if they can put together a team that protects the voting boxes, ballot boxes across the country and oversee that process and count the ballots effectively, and then announce the results, and then basically as a team, right, you know, as all opposition parties, but particularly these six, can challenge Erdogan if there are some voter irregularities. I think given the weakness of the regime, given the current economic crisis, it's going to be very, very difficult for Erdogan to do something like this. And actually engaging in electoral fraud is not as easy as it seems. Just one short comment regarding the foreign policy, because I disagree with the earlier discussion a bit, in the sense that I think foreign policy under Erdogan, just as we're seeing in other countries such as, you know, Trump in US or Orban in Hungary, is very much instrumentalized. So this has nothing to do with state or the old nationalist paranoia that we have, but rather Erdogan, with the help of the media that is controlled by himself, is really pumping a populist nationalist discourse that really mobilizes the public opinion. And, you know, the opposition can't really say much about many of these issues because the positions that Erdogan takes are popular. So trying to defy those positions has nothing to do with CHP's old statist knee-jerk reactions, but rather the electoral reality, particularly, for instance, this NATO debate. So, but and one final comment where I partly disagree with Ersin's just comment about CHP getting stuck at 25% and not many voters associating themselves with secular values. I think we have a growing number of young voters, urban voters, who are a lot more educated, maybe not with post-industrial values, but certainly more educated than the previous generation, who are being now mobilized. And actually, if CHP can come up with an effective agenda and an effective cadres who could appeal to these people, particularly using the party's control over municipality resources in major cities, I think they can begin to increase their vote share. We're beginning to see
the problem there is that we don't have any data backing your argument.
CHP increasing its vote share, you know, to 28, 29%, but I think we need a leadership renewal in order for this to surpass 30%. Kılıçdaroğlu can't do it.
Okay.
The problem there is that we don't have any data backing this point.
Okay.
Ali has a paper, as far as I remember, on the young voting, and his findings show that there is no evidence of this happening until 2019.
All right, I'm sorry. I have to interrupt here because we're running out of time. Dr. Çarkoğlu, last words, please.
Well, I'm totally sympathetic to Berk's expectations about young voters, and I've checked first-time voters in the past. First-time voters are very much divided. They don't lean towards any particular ideological group. They seem to be mimicking their parents' preferences. Young voters as a group, young in Turkey means below 40, basically. They don't seem to have a distinct preference, but there is always a first time. So, and I see Berk Esen's points that this time around, the young voters are the most vulnerable and most hit by the economic crisis, especially in the Southeast and especially in the metropolitan areas. So if you happen to be a university student, you're living on basically almost nothing in the metropolitan areas. And they are suffering, and there is hope that they will vote differently from their parents' votes. But so far as we can see, our data suggests that they have not done so in the past. But I am also hopeful, and I think the argument still stands. I mean, Berke Sen's argument still stands that, you know, there is ground to be hopeful that they will vote differently this time because the media is so much under control. People have lost any trust in the official media outlets. They are now completely relying on the internet. The internet is also very much controlled and regulated, but you can only do so much with the internet. Everybody has a VPN changer in their computers, and they can always find a way of reaching whatever they want to reach. And there the problem is, this is a choice. If they choose to rely on a one-sided argument and continue to log on to the arguments biasly prepared for them in support of the AK Party positions, they will vote no differently this time. But if they choose to go into websites that are critical, then it will be a different story. So it's a very tough environment. We cannot academically follow what's happening in the internet. It's very difficult. So I don't have any reliable data there. There is a lot of misinformation around, especially the Syrian refugees. The Syrian refugees have almost zero crime rate, but the popular image and the public opinion seems to be completely shaped on the opposite side. Like 70–75% believe that crime is due to the Syrian refugees, for instance. And this is a mobilizer for a new party like the Victory Party, Zafer Partisi of Ümit Özdağ, who is running on anti-refugee agenda, which is quite threatening for what could happen in small Anatolian towns, as well as on the outskirts of the metropolitan areas. We can face a very nasty movement against the Syrian refugees as we approach elections. And that would actually mobilize support, I'm afraid, for this small party at the time, which can actually change the balances of the election as this issue of anti-Syrian sentiment rises on the agenda. So there are a lot of unknowns in this on this issue.
Well, unfortunately, we have to leave it there. But Dr. Esen, Dr. Çarkoğlu, Dr. Kalaycıoğlu, fascinating conversation. Thank you.